Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna discuss about fertilizing orchids in semi-hydroponics. This is a pretty delicate subject. There are some subjective things going into the subject, but I will try to give you 2 points of views. The factual point of view and how they usually fertilize orchids in semi-hydroponics, and second, of course, how I do it and why, and explain some stuff related about this subject. So first of all, as a procedure, fertilizing doesn't imply you to change the way you water. You don't need to soak the pot of an orchid or use certain quantities of water or anything of the sorts. In my previous video in which I talked about how to water orchids in semi-hydroponics, I did a demonstration and you can see it on the screen right now. Pretty much this is how you would fertilize as well. But the water would not be plain water, it would be fertilized water, obviously. Afterwards, you don't need to empty the reservoir, you actually don't need to do anything, just leave that fertilized water in the reservoir just like it would be a normal watering, and pretty much that's it in the grand scheme of things. Let's talk a little bit about the fertilizer you should use though. Now, when it comes to the brand of fertilizer you are using, it doesn't matter. There isn't such a thing as a fertilizer destined for semi-hydroponics necessarily. What you have to do is use a water-soluble fertilizer, meaning one that will dissolve or will mix in with water. It can be in a liquid form or in a powder form. As long as it dissolves or mixes well with water, you can use it. However, there is one thing I would like to add. This is more of a personal thing. The fertilizer you use needs to be processed, not organic. And this is not because organic fertilizers are bad. In the semi-hydroponic system, it is impossible to use organic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers rely on soil bacteria and microbes to break them down and make them available for plants. In our semi-hydroponic system, we don't have soil, and we don't actually have soil bacteria and microbes. And even if you would try to provide a colony, it wouldn't really survive because it is a very airy environment. It can go dry. It experiences a lot of fluctuation. After all, we are dealing with epiphytic orchids, not terrestrial orchids. So the use of an organic fertilizer is pretty redundant. There is nothing in the pot to break down those elements, no matter how good they are. And if they cannot change their chemical formula into something plants can recognize and absorb, then all you're gonna do is feed molds and algae and other stuff, except the orchid herself. Therefore, the semi-hydroponic setup implies the use of a processed fertilizer. As I was saying, the brand doesn't matter, just use whatever you have available. If you have a fertilizer that contains a nitrogen source other than urea, because urea is organic, then that's great. Make sure it has macro elements, but micro elements as well. And also try to think about the water you're using. There are some fertilizers which do not contain calcium, for example, but if you're using tap water, maybe that's not a problem for you. And PS, the shorter fertilizer doesn't contain calcium. I used it for a year, never had any issues because I combined it with my tap water. Orchids were perfectly fine. I fixed my nitrogen deficiency as well. It was a really good fertilizer, even though it didn't contain calcium. If I would have used that fertilizer with osmosis water, probably I would have had some issues. So do try to take into consideration the type of water you're using as well. Of course, if you're using rainwater or osmosis water, you kind of need to go for a fertilizer with a complete menu of calcium, magnesium, the macros and the micros as well. The more complete, the better. Other than that, the choice is yours. What I am using is a blend of fertilizers, not because it's necessary or anything, but I am the type of person who likes variety. I have several different deodorants and several different clothes softener that I just rotate between them because it's a personal thing. I like to do that. And I like to have some fertilizers to rotate, but you really don't have to do this. So what I'm using is the MSU, which I have to say is a very good fertilizer for me. And for the semi-hydroponic system, it is complete. It has calcium, magnesium, and I really don't see any issues or problems with it. And I also have the orchid-focused fertilizer, which is a weaker fertilizer, but it contains humic and fulvic acids, which are kind of like vitamins or strengtheners for plants. You can check down below a link which explains the role of humic and fulvic acids. So from time to time, I do like to combine the two. I don't use them at the same time. One time I use this one, the other times the MSU, mostly the MSU. And that's just because I feel it works for me and it does good for me. It doesn't have to make it true though. So basically, you would have to mix the fertilizer that you have in the water you intend to use for watering, and that's that. But there is an important consideration, and this is quantity. You will see that many fertilizers do have instructions, and normally they refer to once a month or once every 2 weeks, a certain quantity to be dissolved in water and then provided to the orchid. When it comes to semi-hydro, it doesn't really work that well. We kind of need to disregard whatever the instructions say and pretty much use a quarter or even less, depending on the orchid, of what they recommend. And I'll tell you why I think that is, but if you search articles or other people's experience, you'll see that everybody recommends using a lot less than what the fertilizer recommends you to use. Anyway, with orchids in general, it's always better to start with a little bit of fertilizer and move your way up. If you see any deficiency, obviously you can pump up a little bit the fertilizer. I personally am using about a quarter strength, but I do use a TDS meter. So whatever I mix in with my water, I try to not make it go over 80 parts per million. Now in winter I fertilized with 50 parts per million. I did not see any deficiencies, but spring is coming, so I'm going to have to up that ratio. Typically, you would fertilize at every watering, and particularly if you are watering how I showed you in the beginning, because using abundant water to fill up the pot and then let it drain, that kind of flushes the pot. If you're doing a different type of watering where you don't necessarily fill up the pot like I do, you would not necessarily fertilize with every watering. I fertilize about 3 or 4 times a month, and then I give a flush with normal water, no fertilizer, and I remove all of that salt buildup. And about the buildup, it's not really a buildup, but we'll get to it. Now, why do people recommend that you use a lot less fertilizer? Well, I do have some theories. Basically, because you are not actually losing any water, everything is collected into that reservoir. That means that the fertilized water is always available for the plant. So you don't actually need to use a big quantity of fertilizer because the fertilizer doesn't go away. It's always there. The medium doesn't consume it, doesn't store it, and we'll get to that. It's always at any point in time available to the orchid as long as it is liquid. Once it solidifies, it's goodbye. But as long as it's liquid in the reservoir, it is always available for orchids, and orchids are not heavy feeders. Whenever we use fertilizer in organic mediums such as bark or even sphagnum moss, we kind of tend to over-fertilize a little bit because most of the fertilizer is just lost through the drainage holes and also in the texture of the medium. Again, we'll get to that. So the overall quantity which is available for the orchid is reduced. In semi-hydroponics, this doesn't happen. And by fertilizing with a quarter strength, you will see most of the times it's enough for the orchid. As I was saying, depending on the orchid, because some orchids are heavier feeders, also depending on your climate, maybe it's warmer, maybe you don't really have winters, you might have to adjust it a little bit. If you see deficiencies, if you see chlorosis signs, which are just leaves, new leaves, yellowing or blackening or something of the sorts, then yeah, maybe you do have a fertilizer issue, maybe you have a deficiency, but for the most part, starting low, it doesn't hurt. And it's better than over-fertilizing, which can definitely burn roots. So that is one aspect of the story. The second, well, it's something a little scarier than that, but to be fully honest, there's nothing scary about it. And this is efflorescence, not inflorescence, efflorescence. So let's go to the definition a little bit. Let's see what Wikipedia says. Efflorescence is a phenomenon that happens with porous materials. It can naturally happen, or it can happen to materials produced by us, by humans. And most notably, in constructions, you will see efflorescence. What it actually implies is the migration of salts from inside a porous material to its surface. And that has behind some physics laws and some chemistry. Pretty much, you cannot help the salts from migrating from inside a porous material to its surface. What are we using here? We're using leca, which is expanded clay. It is very porous on the inside, so efflorescence is bound to happen. But for it to happen, it means we kind of need to have some salts inside. And that is true. We do have salts inside our pots. We fertilize, remember? Whatever salts are not completely utilized by plants, they just tend to stick on the surface. This happens more at the beginning. When you freshly pot an orchid, until she gets adjusted, you will have quite a lot of inflorescence. It also happens more in colder seasons because Orchids don't feed that much in colder seasons, and also there is a type of calcium salt which solidifies more in colder temperatures. And you can check the article down below for that as well. Since we cannot really test what type of salts we have here, we can simply presume there are calcium salts or whatever our fertilizer has, and it's not consumed by the orchid. This of course looks pretty scary, but it tends to go away once you flush the orchid. And once the orchid gets really established, you'll see efflorescence less and less, because there aren't many salts not being consumed by the plant. Efflorescence can actually stain as well, and that stain cannot really be removed unless you get the individual leca pebbles and soak them in vinegar. But really it's not necessary, because that type of staining does not affect orchid roots. It happens in clay pots as well, and for those of you who ever used clay pots with anything, you know they tend to get stained with time. A little staining really doesn't harm anything. But for the main part, efflorescence is a salt which can easily be removed, even with my fingers, as you can see. So when you flush a pot, you are actually dissolving these salts and flushing them. That's why I was saying it's a great idea to flush once a month, just to remove any type of efflorescence you have, any type of buildup. But this, however, is not your typical buildup. Usually when you have orchids in organic materials such as bark and sphagnum moss, you really have to flush them, run water a few times through them, or even soak them. I'll add down below, I think Brad has a video on it. He's actually testing and measuring the buildup he has in his pots, and it's quite dramatic. Ever since I started to use clay materials such as ceramics and even leca, I noticed I never have such a buildup. Although on the surface it looks pretty bad, doesn't it? Well, this is because of the efflorescence phenomenon. See, what happens is that all of the leca pulls out the salts from within, delivers them to the surface. But then what happens? The next layer of leca picks up that moisture and drags it further until the top. And on the top, because there is no more leca, it simply dries. Whatever liquid salt we had on top dries because of the exposure with air. And that's when the efflorescence becomes visible. But this also implies that we don't actually have any buildup within the pot. The only buildup we have is at the surface. And it's not as much as you think. Let's say you water your orchid with tap water, which has 20-30 parts per million. Those little parts per million, which are not absorbed by the orchid, you'll see them and you'll freak out because they look pretty scary. But in an organic or different type of medium, which is not that porous, you would not see this buildup simply because it is trapped within the structures of the material. Sphagnum moss is like a sponge. It keeps the salts inside. Sometimes they are on the surface, but many or most of the times they are inside the sphagnum moss. Bark, the same. The more it degrades, the more it becomes a little spongier. It's a different texture and a different concept, but with this type of medium, and this is my observation, not necessarily the truth, I didn't read it anywhere, so keep that in mind, it's just my deduction. Because of the efflorescence phenomenon, we cannot have a buildup within the leca pebbles themselves. After a while, everything pretty much rises to the surface. And if it rises to the surface, we can see it. This is all the buildup we have, and we can easily flush it with a big quantity of water. This just goes away because, see? It's not sticky staining salt. It's just salt. That's what it is. And when I say salt, I don't mean table salt. It's just calcium and whatever, magnesium, whatever other salts there are. So in the end, efflorescence is actually not a bad thing. It is the indication that we actually don't have salt trapped within the medium. And if we ever soaked our pot, we would see that we would never have that 700 parts per million or 1000 parts per million buildup that other people discovered within their organic pots. Whatever buildup it is, for me personally, it is under 100 parts per million, because I make sure that even if I don't flush with a big quantity of water every time I water, I do let the water drain out a little bit. It's not like topping off. I drain it out a little bit, but not a lot. So that is really, really good news. The roots inside the pot will never get burned because of this issue. But what about the roots on top? Well, this is a different story. Because yes, of course, depending on what salt you have at the top, the roots might get burned or not. If you don't have a lot of salts, or the salts are mainly calcium sorts, and that's just my own opinion, calcium doesn't seem to burn as much as other salts, which are more crystally That white powdery stuff, that's usually calcium. If you have that type of efflorescence or not excessive efflorescence, the roots grow just fine. For me, I've never observed a really burnt root tip at the top as long as I maintained the efflorescence under control. If I would let it build up all the time, yes, probably there is a very high chance that I would burn the surface roots. So you have to keep that in mind and be careful and keep it under control. But as you can see, I am keeping it under control and it's not that bad. And the benefit of the phenomenon is something that I truly like, because in all honesty, I never have to super flush or deeply flush the pots. And by that I mean soaking the pots, letting the deposits or whatever salts are accumulated spread in the water, like I used to do with the organic setup. Combined with the fact that I don't use as much fertilizer as with other setups, everything is just more economical, and that efflorescence at the top is proof for me that I don't have buildup inside the pot, which I don't see, which would be a lot worse. I have it at the top and I can see it. Whenever I consider it's too much, I can go and make a super flush and pretty much my problems are over. And before we end this subject, let's talk a little bit about preparing the water. This is something you can do no matter the setup. You know, there are acids on the market, usually called pH down, which prepare the water you are going to use. If you have a water with a very high pH, using those types of products might be useful no matter the setup. Well, this will depend on the water you are using. Since I'm using osmosis water with a pH of around 7, when I add my fertilizers, the pH goes down as well. It goes down to 6.5 or something, even if I don't use a large quantity of fertilizer, because my water is very poorly buffered. As you might know, a while back I discovered that leca, or at least some brands of leca, tend to alter the water pH. And you have down below the link to that video. I'm not going to insist on it. I was trying out that peat at the bottom in the reservoir just to maintain the pH low. Well, I don't really do it as a norm. That's an experiment which still goes on. And to be quite frank, I don't notice any super big difference, as much as to say, yes, from now on, I'm going to add that peat all the time. It appears that my orchids are doing perfectly fine without the peat and the leca, and with my normal fertilizer regime, I don't alter the pH of my water. It's simply not needed as far as I can see in the past, let's say, half a year. This might change in the future. For now, I'm not actually improving my water quality with anything. But of course, these are options that you have on the market, but you just need to research a little bit, because altering things can be catastrophic if you don't know what you're doing. And that's about it for our subject. I hope you've enjoyed this. There are many ways in which people fertilize their orchids. When it comes to semi-hydroponics, I prefer to give you the basics. Just use a water-soluble fertilizer. The choice is yours. I would go for processed ones, not organic ones. And of course, use a very low quantity, especially at first. So with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this, and remember, if you did, give this video a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!